Good morning. My name is Cody, and this is our checkpoint 8 on how do different carried loads affect lower limb strain and gait in soldiers on long road marches, and what can be done to reduce fatigue and injury. For our agenda, we're going to cover a brief introduction as to why I chose to do this project, and then we'll go into individual factors and criteria that I found to have an effect based on some of the research that I was able to find. Um, and those different criteria are varying load, footwear, varying speed, and terrain, and how all of them can affect the gait and the strain. Then we'll go over a brief conclusion um, on what ultimately I found and what I can assess. So to start, there is a inherent requirement for service members to be competent and confident when carrying loads to simulate the dismounted movements that they have to perform when a mounted movement is not able to be conducted for whatever the case. So, what we mean by under load is carrying a rucksack or an external pack. Um, Oftentimes, it is at a minimum 35 pounds. You're carrying any type of equipment you may need for up to 72 hours. You're carrying medical supplies, you're carrying water, you're carrying ammunition, essentially whatever you may need for whatever circumstance may arise. So, what I found is that since the Civil War, the pack loads have essentially doubled. And so, what that means is that the different fighting styles that we are encountering. War is evolving, therefore, the amount of materials and the amount of supplies that service members need is changing, and they need more. So we can only assume that with the emergence of drone warfare, that the additional weight that service members will carry in the wars to come will also raise in order to prevent the drones. So um, another study that I saw, they looked at injuries related to road marches and carrying external packs. So the initial entry training portion, they're looking at service members that are going through basic training and AIT. And for some of these soldiers, it is the first time that they're walking in combat boots. It could be the first time that they're carrying a rucksack or an external load of something that is greater than a backpack. And for some, it's also the first time that they are getting more than 10,000 steps in a day. So they saw that 23% of female trainees and about 24% of male trainees experienced a lower extremity injury in the form of a stress fracture, a blister, a muscle strain, anything like that. So it's a fairly large number, but what it can tell us is that those people that are underprepared or have never experienced a loaded march, will see an injury in about one of every four. And then in the same paper or same study, the individuals looked at the United States infantry. So the United States infantry, or the U.S. Army infantry, is an organization that is the primary force that will be doing these dismounted movements. Um, and they found that after one singular 12-mile march, 17 to 22% of a brigade-sized element went to see medical providers for the similar injuries as the trainees. So the likelihood of injury goes down a little bit with um, the experience, but not all the members of that unit that went in actually went in to see if they were injured. So you may have some underlying individuals that were actually hurt but didn't go see a medical provider because they didn't want to be seen as weak or whatever the case is. So the numbers could be higher, but also numbers could be lower. Could have seen somebody go in to um, see a medical provider because they just didn't want to go to work the next day. But we do see that experience can potentially decrease the rate of injury. So next we'll look at the how varying load will affect. This was the first piece of research that I wanted to dive into, mainly to see how different loads can affect the strain that we're seeing. So I looked at what is the amount of load that we are experiencing unloaded, and I found that on average it's about 0.25 newtons per pound of body weight of propulsion at a propulsion ground uh, reaction force. And so Birrell and Haslam, they did a fairly large study where they looked at 12 different load combinations of how the pack was worn, and those four different weights you see there, 8 kilograms, 16, and 24. Uh, and the most notable results show that as the pack loads increase, the mean thrust max value will also increase. And that tells us that the amount of force on the ground is greatly higher than that of what we are experiencing when we're loaded or when we're walking at an unloaded rate. And at 16 kilograms of external pack, which is about 32 pounds, which is closely related to what we are experiencing as our baseline standard for the Army at 35 pounds. Service member or person carrying that weight is carrying about 5 times the amount of ground reaction force with that load. So it's a fairly high increase. They also found that there's a 10% increase in max braking force with the 32 kilogram load, which puts an extreme amount of strain on the body. Um, and Drew et al., they looked at 3 different body-borne loads, and they primarily looked at the knee, um, which is a um, very important joint as we're walking through the gait. And they found that the peak amount of knee adduction will increase as loads increase, and they believe that that also has serious osteoarthritis implications due to the amount of torque on the knee joint. But they also found that time did not have significant effects on the peak knee angle moment. By their time assessment, it was an hour of marching or of walking. So Wang et al., they performed different types of assessments on their participants. They would walk loaded and unfatigued. They would walk loaded and fatigued. They would walk unloaded, unfatigued, unloaded, and fatigued. So they looked at all different types to see how the fatigue and load will have an effect. And essentially, they found that when the muscles were fatigued, the peak vertical ground reaction force would increase by 2.23% than when compared to loaded and unfatigued. They also found that just load itself will increase the peak vertical ground reaction force by about 110%, and the braking ground reaction force will be increased by about 86%, which again amplifies the amount of stress on the body, as we saw with the 32 kilogram pack when the Birrell and Haslam research. Walsh and Harrison, they found that when walking under a load, the stability of the muscles decreased and the EMG activity in the traps, the erector spinae, the erector femoris, and the gastrocnemius, which are all primary movers of the lower extremities, they showed an increase in EMG activity. So we know that more load will increase ground reaction force, strain on the knee, it'll decrease stability, and it'll increase the muscle activity that we have. Next, we look at footwear. Um, Footwear is a pretty big one because service members will typically wear whatever's comfortable. Um, Sometimes people will be doing ruck marches in soft shoes or running shoes that we see. Um, so not entirely, or initially I was not sure if a running shoe was better or if a boot was better. But Yao et al. Looked at something similar. They looked at the combat shoes and the in-shoe forces and their comfort levels. They compared them. So they put the people in different different boots, measured the comfort levels on a scale of 1 to 7, and they found that the boots that showed a significant increase in load rate and uh, second peak force were those that had the thinner heel and were also those that were rated more comfortably, which is, again, interesting because soldiers sometimes choose boots that are primarily just comfortable, and that may be worse for them because um, that ground reaction force. Also, we found that, or they found that the comfortable shoes also lead to an increase in walking speed, which an increase in walking speed may potentially increase ground reaction force. Um, but ultimately, the more comfortable shoes showed an increase in the loading rate um, across this study. Binney et al. Also looked at a comparison in ground reaction force in boots and sports shoes. Um, they found that the boots also displayed a significant increase in load rate and the second peak force. Um, and then ultimately, the boots did not optimize the load transmission. Uh, so then I went to look at how speed can impact the, uh, or if there was any correlation between speed. None of the studies specifically looked at speed, but the majority of them dictated the speed that the participants walked at. Um, so people will often follow a walk a while, jog a while method when they're doing their ruck marches. So their speeds will change. They're not always a constant speed. And the standard speed for passing a 12-mile ruck march is 3 hours, which is about 1.8 meters per second, which none of the studies that I found required their participants to do so. So I would assume that a lot of these numbers that we see here would increase with the 1.8 meters per second being prescribed. But as we see here in the chart, we see the newtons per pound of body weight from the previous slide. Yao also show that when the individuals are not walking at a prescribed speed, we see about 1,000 newtons of peak force and 9 to 10,000 newtons per second of load rate. Uh, so the loads increase the vertical ground reaction force. And again, Yao allowed people to walk at self-selected speeds. Binney, again, at 1.39 meters per second, they saw the second peak force nearly double. Drew, as we saw earlier, walking at 1.3 meters per second, and then Wang at 1.67 meters per second. They show a 51 and 57% increase in peak vertical ground reaction force. So what all this information tells me is that if the speeds increase, the force will also increase as the loads stay the same. So looking at terrain, because there is not always going to be a flat terrain that the soldiers can walk on, I was able to find one study where Walsh and Harrison looked at people walking from a 0% to a 10% grade on a treadmill. Um, when the individuals were walking at that 10% grade, the muscles showed less dynamic stability and an increased vertical Myapulanov exponent. Sorry if I butchered that. But essentially, when you're walking uphill, you have less stability in the muscles. And also, when you're walking uphill, there is a lower stride time, which increases variability. And the other studies that I found, because of having to do them um, in labs and colleges and stuff like that, they're using tracks and flat terrain or a treadmill. So just hard to find how terrain ultimately impacts it, but we do see that when you're walking uphill, you have less stability. So ultimately, we wanted to see how we can reduce the injury and fatigue that we see. Um, so my first instinct was to look at exoskeletons to see what they can do. I found a review that looked at all the different types of exoskeletons. I couldn't find the use of an exoskeleton on people that are walking under load specifically in the manner that I wanted to, but there are definitely exoskeleton um, options out there, whether they are powered, unpowered, or quasi-powered. They can be multi-joint, knee, hip, or ankle assistive, and they do show to reduce the amount of um, muscle activity and the metabolic consumption. Ullman also looked at the comparison between experienced participants and inexperienced participants. Um, and the experienced participants displayed the reduced variability in their joints. So that can be related back to how we saw the initial term soldiers increasing their likelihood of injury. Wang also looked at um, with fatigue. When you get fatigued, you will see an increase in peak ground reaction force, loading rate, and braking rate. So if we can fend off that fatigue, we could potentially see the lower risk of injury. We also see that when the load is centralized to the center of mass, it will have less strain. So, in conclusion, we can say that as loads increase, the strain of the lower limbs will also increase. And we can also say that if we do our best to utilize strength and conditioning principles in the form of individualization, overload, and progression, we can prevent injury and reduce fatigue as we're doing these load marches. So, we just have to be smart with how we're approaching it. These are my references. Thank you all for your time.